Helen Whitford was 72 years old when life taught her, in the cruelest way, that kindness doesn't always return in the same measure as it is given. In her small town in inland Texas, everyone knew her for her impeccable manners and her habit of offering help before anyone even asked. Since becoming a widow, she lived alone in a small house with cream-colored curtains and a garden that smelled of lavender at dusk. Her routine was simple: freshly brewed coffee, subscription letters to the POW, local newspaper, and calls from her children Daniel and Lisa, which almost always began with, "Mom, could you do me a favor?" Helen didn't complain. She believed that was her role in the world: to support, to care, to solve problems. But that April morning, while preparing her breakfast, the spoon slipped from her hand. She felt a brief dizziness, a void in her head, and everything went white. She woke up in the hospital, surrounded by the hum of machines and the smell of disinfectant. The nurse gently explained that she had suffered a minor stroke, nothing serious, but that she would need to stay for a few days under observation. Helen nodded, certain that her children would appear at any moment. She had faith that Daniel would cancel plans and Lisa would leave the children with her husband to come and see her. But the hours passed, and then the days, and the only company was the clock ticking away the seconds like a reminder of her absence. On the third night, a young nurse, looking embarrassed, showed her some photographs on her phone. Daniel and Lisa were smiling under the Eiffel Tower, toasting with glasses of wine, using the same money she had saved for her medicine. It was at that moment that Helen understood that something had been broken forever, and it wasn't her health. The following days became a mixture of silence and repetitive thoughts. Helen stared at the white hospital ceiling and imagined her children in some elegant Parisian cafe, laughing without a thought for her. She recalled every time she had paid their debts, every time she had sacrificed something of her own so that they would be all right. It wasn't the money that hurt, but the realization that her love had become a transaction. When she was finally discharged, she left the hospital slowly, carrying a plastic bag with her medications and feeling as if she had aged 10 years in 3 days. When she got home, the air was heavy, as if the walls themselves knew what had happened. The mailbox was overflowing with overdue bills. The plants on the porch had withered. Helen laid her purse on the table and looked at her bank statement. International flights, expensive dinners, boutique purchases, all on her card. Her heart sank, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't cry. Instead, she felt an eerie clarity, a calm that smelled like the end of something. She made herself some tea, sat by the window, and thought that maybe it was time to stop being the one who saves everyone and start saving herself. All her life, Helen had believed that love was shown through sacrifice. From a young age, she had learned to put the needs of others before her own. But that night, in the solitude of her home, she understood that her devotion had fueled a dependency disguised as affection. She remembered the times Daniel called her only to ask for money, or the occasions when Lisa visited her with shopping lists and a casual kiss on the cheek. Now, it all made sense. With a notebook in her hands, she began to jot down dates, amounts, and feelings, as if she wanted to reconstruct the exact map of her disillusionment. Each line written was a small step toward regaining control. The next day, she walked purposefully to the bank. Her voice trembled at first, but she was firm in demanding that the cards be canceled and a new account opened in her name at a different bank, far from her children's reach. She sold her car, an old blue sedan that still carried her husband's cologne, and deposited the money into this new secret account. Then she called a locksmith to change all the locks. For the first time as she closed the door, she felt that the metallic sound wasn't one of fear, but of freedom. The telephone rang more than once that afternoon, but Helen didn't answer. She knew she had nothing to explain. As the days passed, the house transformed into a lighter version of itself. Helen began tidying the closets, packing away mementos and separating what truly belonged to her from what she kept only out of habit. Each box she closed represented an unfinished conversation she no longer needed to have. Among old photographs and embroidered tablecloths, she found a letter from her late husband, written on a distant anniversary. It read, "Never forget who you are when no one needs you." That phrase lingered in her mind like a silent compass. Perhaps, she thought, it was time to reconnect with the woman who had fallen asleep behind the titles of mom and grandmother. One afternoon, as the sun bathed the blinds in gold, Helen sat with a cup of tea and reviewed her bank statements. She saw the stark contrast between her reality and that of her children. While she carefully measured her medication to save money, they stayed in hotels overlooking the Seine. She felt no hatred, but rather a kind of quiet disappointment, the kind that comes when you realize you can no longer change anyone. In that silence, she made a final decision. She would sell. The house, not out of spite, but to start anew. It was time to transform her pain into action. The sale ad appeared in the local newspaper 3 days later. Family home with garden. Excellent location. The neighbors were surprised. Some even approached to ask if it was a temporary situation. Helen smiled with the serenity that comes when you no longer need to justify anything. As she packed the antique china, she thought about how each object held a story she no longer needed to carry. She called a young real estate agent, Laura, who in a kind voice told her they would soon find a buyer. Helen nodded. Her plan wasn't to run away, but to be reborn. That night, under the dim light of the hallway, she wrote a letter to Daniel and Lisa. She wouldn't send it yet, but she needed to put her thoughts into words. She explained what she had felt in the hospital, how each silence was a crack that eventually brought down the edifice of love she had built. Then she added a final sentence that came to her without thinking. "Don't seek my forgiveness. Seek to understand your absence." She folded the letter carefully, like someone closing a clean wound, and put it in a box next to the papers for the will she would soon amend. In the following days, Helen began to organize her finances with surgical precision. She reviewed every receipt, every charge on the bank statement, every date associated with her children's expenses. She noted everything in a green notebook. May 14th, Hotel Inn No. Rome, $640. That same day, I received the diagnosis. Reading it aloud, she felt that finally someone, even if it was herself, was validating her pain. She was no longer just a victim, but a lucid witness to her own story. Each detail she noted became a line of defense, not against them, but against the habit of forgiving everything. With the help of Laura, the real estate agent, the sale moved quickly. A young couple fell in love with the garden and offered to pay in cash. Helen accepted without hesitation. At the same time, she changed her will with the town lawyer. Instead of leaving everything to Daniel and Lisa, she bequeathed it all to an educational fund for underprivileged children. At least they'll know how to appreciate what they're given, she thought, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in years. That night, for the first time in a long time, she slept soundly. She didn't dream of recriminations or justifications, only of a new horizon opening up before her. The day she signed the deed of sale, Helen wore her best blouse, the one with mother-of-pearl buttons she used to wear to family parties. It wasn't an act of sadness, but a dignified farewell. She handed over the keys, walked to the bank, and withdrew some of the cash, enough to begin a new chapter far from the noise of memories. When she stepped outside, the warm summer breeze caressed her face, and for the first time in a long time she felt weightless. She stopped at the corner and looked north. She didn't have a specific destination, but she carried with her something worth more than any direction, the certainty that she had survived. That same afternoon, she took a bus to the coast, with a small suitcase and a heart that unraveled with every kilometer traveled. During the journey, she watched the sunflower fields, the solitary gas stations, and the clouds that seemed to follow her through the window. She thought about Daniel and Lisa, about how their love had become an awkward silence, a moral debt with no possibility of repayment. Yet there was no resentment, only a sense of closure. Upon arriving at the small coastal town, She rented a simple cabin facing the sea. The sand was coarse, the seagulls noisy, but the place smelled of new beginnings. The first few days on the coast were strange, as if she were learning to exist without the invisible threads that bound her to the past. Helen would get up early, make her coffee, and go for walks along the shore with a notebook under her arm. She wrote about the waves, about the sound of the wind rattling the blinds, about life going on without asking permission. Soon, some neighbors began to greet her. An elderly couple brought her freshly baked bread, and a child gave her a heart-shaped seashell. They were simple gestures, but genuine. Helen understood that kindness hadn't disappeared from the world. It had only changed direction. One afternoon, as she watched the sun disappear into the sea, she dared to check her children's social media. The photos were still there: strolls through Rome, shopping in London, laughter in Venice. Each image echoed the abandonment, but also served as a reminder of how much she had changed since then. She closed her phone and set it aside. She no longer needed to know what they were doing or where they were. Her story didn't depend on them. She was free, even though freedom sometimes hurt. That night she wrote in her notebook, "I am alone, but I am no longer lost." The sound of the sea became her constant companion. Helen began to enjoy the small routines that had previously gone unnoticed: hanging laundry in the sun, reading without interruption, cooking just for herself. In the village, some knew her as the lady with the green notebook. Sometimes in the cafe across from the pier, they would ask her to share fragments of her story. She would do so without drama, with the serenity of someone who had learned to look at her past without fear. Her voice, soft yet firm, conveyed a contagious calm. And although she didn't say it openly, telling her story was her way of healing. It was during one of those afternoons in the cafe that Helen decided to write her final letter. Not to send it, but to read it aloud and bring things to a close. In it, she thanked her children for who they once were, but also returned to them the weight of their decisions. She acknowledged her own mistakes, such as confusing love with endless availability. When she finished, she took a deep breath and threw the letter into the fire of a small fireplace. The flames illuminated her face, reflecting something that seemed like peace. That simple gesture was more powerful than any revenge. It was her way of saying to herself, "That's enough." The days passed peacefully. Helen began volunteering at a small community center where she taught reading to neighborhood children. Many of them arrived barefoot, with torn backpacks and eyes full of curiosity. At first, she did it to, keep busy, but she soon realized that this place gave her a purpose she had forgotten. One of the children, Tommy, told her one afternoon, "Mrs. Helen, you smell like home." That phrase moved her to tears. In those small gestures, she understood that she could still be a mother, not by blood, but by spirit. That night, as she wrote in her journal to the sound of the sea, she thought of all the people who, like her, had given so much and received so little. She imagined that someone, somewhere, would read her story and find solace in it. And if you're listening to this now, perhaps you too know that silent pain of feeling forgotten. Tell me where you're coming from to see this story, and share it, so others remember that it's still possible to rebuild after abandonment, because sometimes sharing is also a way to heal. The next day, Helen received an unexpected call. It was Daniel. His voice sounded nervous, broken, like a child searching for an excuse. He told her they had returned from Europe and were standing in front of the house, but the locks weren't working. "Where are you, Mom?" he asked. She remained silent, listening to the distant sound of the sea mingled with her son's guilt. She didn't answer. She hung up the phone with a steady hand and placed it on the table next to a steaming cup of tea. It wasn't cruelty. It was simply the end of a story that no longer deserved to be repeated. During the following days, Daniel and Lisa called her again and again. They left. Tearful messages, promises, pleas. But Helen didn't answer. She knew they weren't looking for the mother, but for the money, for the comfort she represented. When the calls stopped, the silence that remained was different from before. It didn't hurt. It was clean, necessary. In that silence, Helen learned the true meaning of peace. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of emotional dependence. For the first time, the world wasn't asking anything of her, and that, she thought, was freedom. Weeks later, Daniel and Lisa appeared at the cabin door. They had found it thanks to an old friend from the neighborhood. They arrived unannounced, their faces etched with exhaustion and despair. Helen saw them from the window, standing facing the sea, their hands clasped together like two lost children. She calmly opened the door and let them in. There were no hugs or recriminations, only a heavy silence, heavy with all that had gone unsaid. Daniel was the first to speak, asking for forgiveness. Lisa wept, saying they hadn't known what they were doing. Helen listened to them respectfully, but without weakness. "You knew exactly what you were doing," she finally said, with a serenity that chilled the air. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She explained that she had changed her will and was no longer dependent on anyone. "You stole money from me, yes, but what you really took from me was time that will never return." The children remained silent, unable to meet her gaze. When they left, Helen closed the door without anger, only with the feeling that at last the story had come to an end. Outside, the waves continued to crash against the rocks, like a slow applause from life acknowledging her courage. As the days passed, Helen returned to her peaceful routine by the sea. The encounter with her children had left her exhausted, but also lighter. She no longer had any unfinished business, no words stuck in her throat. At the community center, they greeted her with hugs, and the children told her how much their reading had improved. One of them asked if she had family, and she replied with a smile, "Yes, many grandchildren at heart." No one needed further explanation. That answer was enough to seal the closure of a chapter she could finally leave behind without pain. Weeks turned into months, and the cabin filled with new habits, fresh flowers on the table, underlined passages in books, thank you notes from the village children. Helen began, painting small watercolors of the coastal landscape, and a local shopkeeper offered to sell them in his store. The first time she saw someone buy one, she felt a pride she hadn't experienced in years. She had transformed loss into art, abandonment into independence. Her story, which began with betrayal, was now a testament to resilience. And in this new version of herself, Helen discovered that gratitude could bloom even after winter. One morning, while walking along the beach, Helen found an old glass bottle washed ashore. Inside was a barely legible note that read, "Thank you for believing there are still good people." No one knew who wrote it, but she kept it as a reminder that good always finds a way back, even if it takes time. That phrase became her daily motto. Every time she taught a child or gave away one of her paintings, she felt the universe returning pieces of hope to her, one by one. Autumn arrived with its gentle breeze and golden leaves that piled up in front of the cabin. Helen watched as the landscape changed without asking permission, reminding her that everything in life has a cycle, even pain. The children from the community center were preparing a small exhibition of their drawings, and they invited her to be the event's godmother. When she stepped onto the small wooden stage to give thanks, her voice trembled, not from sadness, but from emotion. She said that it's never too late to relearn, nor to let others teach us to believe again. That afternoon, the applause sounded like a collective embrace. As the months passed, Helen began receiving letters from grateful former students and neighbors. Many told her how her story had inspired them to reconcile with parents, children, or themselves. Some even traveled to the village to meet her, and she welcomed them with tea and shortbread. She didn't see herself as a hero. She said she had simply done what any weary heart would do: choose peace. In those encounters, she understood that forgiveness wasn't a gift for others, but a key to her own freedom. One December afternoon, as the sky turned lilac, Helen received a letter with no return address. Inside, a simple sheet of paper bore a handwritten message. Thank you for showing me I can still be a better person. D. She knew immediately it was from Daniel. She felt no need to reply. She tucked the letter between the pages of her green notebook and smiled, a mixture of sadness and gratitude in her voice. She didn't need words. Sometimes, silence is also a form of reconciliation. She closed the notebook, breathed in the scent of the sea, and let the breeze carry away any trace of resentment. That night, as she ate hot soup by the fire, she reflected on everything she had learned since that day in the hospital. It wasn't a story of revenge or punishment, but of rebirth. She had understood that one can lose everything, trust, relationships, even health, and still find meaning in the small things. She had gone from being the woman who waited for phone calls to being the woman who no longer needed them. And in that quiet change lay her true victory. Outside, the sea continued to roar, but now that sound was familiar, like a song written just for her. With the new year came new habits. Helen began teaching painting classes at the community center, mixing colors with the same patience she had used to rebuild her life. The children approached her not only to learn to draw, but also to hear her stories. She spoke of resilience, of second chances, and of how sometimes what is lost makes room for what truly matters. Each brushstroke was a reflection of what she felt. Freedom. The walls of the small room were soon filled with colorful paintings, testaments to lives that still believed in hope. One afternoon, Laura, the young real estate agent who had helped her sell the house, visited her. She told her that Daniel had tried to contact her, that he seemed remorseful, and that he had even made a donation to a children's charity in her name. Helen listened with a calm smile. She didn't need confirmation or public gestures. She knew that somehow life always finds its balance. She thanked her for the visit and offered her a cup of tea. When Laura left, she wrote in her diary, "Sometimes change comes silently, disguised as someone else's doing, but you recognize it by the peace it leaves behind." Over time, Helen grew accustomed to the sunrises over the sea. Each day held a different hue, as if the sky wanted to remind her that there were still shades to be discovered. Sometimes she thought about her husband, about how he would have reacted to everything that had happened. She imagined he would be proud, not of the strength she had shown, but of the serenity with which she had chosen to live. She no longer carried the weight of others' guilt. Her life had become simple, light, filled with everyday details that had previously gone unnoticed. One morning, while collecting seashells on the shore, she came across a group of veterans doing rehabilitation therapy on the beach. Some walked with difficulty, others could barely stand, but all smiled with the determination of those who refused to give up. Helen approached them to talk, and soon joined them as a volunteer, helping prepare breakfast and assisting them with their exercises. She discovered that sharing silences with those who also knew loss gave her a different, deeper strength. It was the certainty that healing isn't always about forgetting, but about learning to keep walking, even with the scars. Contact with the veterans gave her back something she thought she'd lost, a sense of belonging. Every story she heard, a return, an absence, a fallen comrade, connected her to her own inner struggle. She understood that, although the wounds were different, the process of starting over was the same for everyone. Sometimes, after rehabilitation sessions, they would sit and watch the sunset in silence. In that shared silence, there was more truth than in 1,000 empty conversations. Helen felt that by caring for them, she was also caring for herself. One of the veterans, a woman named Marjorie, became her closest friend. They would spend entire afternoons talking about books, recipes, and life before the tragedy. Marjorie had lost her son in the service, and in Helen she found a maternal calm that helped her through the difficult days. "I didn't know I could laugh like that again," she confessed one day through tears. Helen hugged her without saying a word, knowing that no comfort was needed, only presence. From then on, the two walked together every morning, learning that true companionship asks for nothing, it simply is. Her connection with Marjorie led her to become even more involved in the support center. She began coordinating reading and art activities for veterans in recovery. The walls became covered with drawings, poems, and photographs that spoke of resilience and remembrance. Helen became a kind of maternal figure to everyone, someone who listened without judgment. In those encounters, she understood something profound. Life hadn't taken away her role as a mother. It had simply shown her to whom she should entrust it. It was no longer about blood ties, but about purpose. One rainy afternoon, while she was organizing books downtown, Daniel appeared at the door. He was soaked, holding a bouquet of white lilies. Helen looked at him calmly, without surprise. There was no resentment on her face, only distance. Daniel asked to speak with her, and she nodded. They sat in front of a misted window, the sound of rain filling the awkward silences. "I've changed, Mom," he said softly. "I'm not looking for your forgiveness anymore. I just wanted to thank you." Helen listened, and for the first time in a long time, she believed his words. Daniel told her he had left his job at the financial firm and was now volunteering with an organization that offered scholarships to underprivileged youth. "It was your letter that woke me up," he confessed. Helen didn't reply immediately. She just watched him, trying to recognize in this man the boy she once was. She didn't know if the change would last, but for the first time she felt she didn't need to doubt. When they said goodbye, he kissed her forehead and said, "Now I understand what love truly was." Helen closed the door slowly, and a tear slipped down her cheek, not out of sadness, just as a sign of closure. That night, Helen walked along the beach until late. The sky was clear, and the moon reflected in the water like a renewed promise. She felt something inside her settle, like a peace finally finding its place. She thought of Lisa, of her grandchildren, and wished them well, too. She didn't need to see them again to love them. Love doesn't always demand presence. Sometimes simply wishing them well in silence is enough. With the wind on her face and the sound of the waves, she understood that peace doesn't come when everything is right, but when you stop fighting against what has already happened. Months passed, and Helen's story began to circulate among the townspeople. Some said her life was like one of those novels you read in one sitting and remember for a lifetime. She laughed when she heard it, because she had never felt like the protagonist of anything. Nevertheless, she gratefully accepted every gesture of kindness. She was invited to give a short talk at the community center, where she spoke about dignity, boundaries, and forgiveness. Her calm, warm voice filled the room. When she finished, the applause wasn't loud, but long and heartfelt, as if everyone understood what it meant to rebuild oneself after having been forgotten. That day, Helen walked back along the coast. The wind stirred her gray hair, and the scent of salt enveloped her like a familiar perfume. She paused for a moment, gazing at the horizon, and reflected on how far she had come since that morning at the hospital. She had gone from abandonment to equilibrium, from imposed silence to finding her own voice. And although she remained the same kind woman she had always been, she was no longer naive. Now she knew that loving also meant knowing when to let go. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and silently gave thanks for still being alive, for continuing to choose peace. As time went on, Helen continued to find small reasons to smile. The children at the center gave her drawings with phrases like, "Thank you for teaching me to believe," and the veterans told her that her presence reminded them that life could begin many times over. Each day was a new page, without haste or expectations. She had stopped looking back. There was nothing there that called to her anymore. When the sun set, she would sit on the porch with a blanket over her legs and listen to the murmur of the sea. That calm wasn't loneliness, it was fullness. And if you've made it this far, perhaps this story has touched your soul, too. Tell me where you're watching from and share it, so more people remember that true freedom begins when you stop begging for love. Because we all deserve a rebirth, regardless of age, past, or wounds. Sometimes all it takes is one step, just one, to leave behind everything that hurts and open the door to the life that still awaits us. That night, Helen wrote one last entry in her green notebook. The words flowed effortlessly. I've learned that family doesn't always have my last name, but they do have my love. I've learned that forgiveness isn't begged for, it's chosen. And above all, I've learned that peace doesn't come when everything falls into place, but when you stop fighting what you can't change. She closed the notebook, placed it on the table, and lit a small candle. The light danced across the cabin walls, warm and soft, like a reflection of her serenity. The next day, she walked along the shore at dawn. The sea was calm, and the sky was painted in shades of pink. Helen paused to gaze at the horizon and smiled. She needed nothing more, no apologies, no promises, no certainties. She had found what many spend a lifetime searching for: peace with their past and gratitude for the present. As the wind played with her hair, she thought that somehow all her losses had brought her right to this point, and with each step on the sand, she confirmed that her story, though marked by abandonment, ended in freedom. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the sea, Helen sat in front of her cabin with a cup of tea and a blanket on her knees. Around her, the laughter of the village children filled the air, and a few veterans came over to greet her. Life had become simple, unadorned, yet full of meaning. No one called her mom, and yet everyone considered her family. Helen understood then that she had accomplished the most difficult thing: transforming loneliness into companionship and pain into a lesson. Her gaze, fixed on the horizon, showed not nostalgia but fulfillment. As night fell, a gentle breeze stirred the curtains and slowly extinguished the candle that illuminated her living room. On the table, her green notebook lay open, as if awaiting new words that were no longer needed. Helen lay back, closed her eyes, and listened to the sound of the sea mingling with her own quiet breathing. It wasn't an ending, but a well-deserved rest after a long journey. Somewhere, far away, life went on. But there, in that small house by the sea, the world could be summed up in a single truth: peace, too, can be a form of victory.